Hey friends, welcome to End Time Talks. I'm Joel Richardson. Together, Dalton Thomas and I are tag teaming, each doing 5 to 15 minute segments on the issue of the end times, current events, the interrelationship between those two things, and what the Bible has to say about these matters. Now, if you're looking for more than just bite-sized segments, then do be sure to download the Frontier Alliance International app. This is an app that is chock full of excellent, relevant content. Everything from music to music videos to full-length feature films to studies through different books of the Bible. We've got an end-time study on Daniel and Revelation, articles, all kinds of relevant updates and information. Okay, it is available for free on every major app platform. So download the app, Frontier Alliance International. You will absolutely be very happy that you did. So God bless and Maranatha. Hey friends, welcome back to End Time Talks. In previous installments, we've taken a few sessions to discuss the Battle of Gog Magog, found in Ezekiel 38 and 39. And of course, as I have presented my opinion, I believe that Gog is simply another name for the Antichrist. However, if you were to read any number of very popular prophecy books, particularly written by Americans, you know that it's most often taught that Gog is presented as an evil end-time dictator, usually from Russia, that will lead a Middle Eastern and North African coalition of nations against the land of Israel. But this evil end-time dictator, he's not the Antichrist. He's a preliminary end-time bad guy. He's sort of the penultimate or secondary evil dictator that will lead this massive coalition of nations into an invasion of Israel. But he's different than the Antichrist, who will also lead a massive multinational coalition of nations in an invasion of Israel. And again, I simply believe that Ezekiel is simply telling the same story that all of the other prophets have been telling from the beginning. The reason, however, that so many popular prophecy teachers reject the idea that Gog is the Antichrist is because it's very clear that Gog does not come from Europe. And because so many of them begin with this assumption, this presumption, that the Antichrist must be Roman, he must come from Europe, when they see this other prophecy, which again describes the same thing that all the other prophets are describing, they don't know what to do with it, and so they're forced to sort of create this secondary narrative. But the bottom line is, if we're to simply look at this prophecy from a Jewish perspective, just separate all of these popular American prophecy books. Imagine you've never read them. You just come to the text. How would you understand Gog? What is the Jewish view? What was the first century Jewish understanding of Ezekiel 38 and 39? Because again, this is one of the most important, towering, detailed end-time prophecies in the entire Old Testament. So getting it right, in my opinion, is pretty important. Now, in order to understand this, again, from a Jewish perspective, we have to understand where Gog fits within the storyline that God is telling. Now, of course, the Lord's sort of throughout the Scriptures telling various stories. There's different narratives that are interwoven throughout the Scriptures. But the main narrative, the central narrative, it is and it always has been the narrative concerning Jesus, right? The spirit of prophecy is the testimony, the prophetic testimony of Jesus. And any study of messianic prophecy is always going to begin where? Genesis 3:15. It's the proto-evangelion. It's the first gospel. As soon as the fall happened, okay, as soon as corruption and death has entered the human experience, the Lord declares to the serpent, he says, I'm going to put enmity between you and the woman, between your descendants, your seed, and her seed. And then he introduces the Messiah. He says, he will crush your head. You'll bruise his heel. You'll strike his heel, but he is going to crush your head. And so the Messiah, at the very beginning of the Bible, he is introduced as the skull crusher, the serpent crusher, okay? And that's good news. We're waiting for the one who will come and ultimately put an end to wickedness. And not just wickedness, not just the serpent, but the effects that the serpent wrought when he brought in the deception to Adam and Eve, and ultimately the fall and the curse and all that came with it. And so this promised one is going to restore Eden. He's going to restore Eden. And that's sort of the foundation of who the Messiah is. Now, still in the book of Genesis, when we get to Genesis chapter 49, as Jacob is dying, he gives a prophetic blessing to all of his children, and he prophesies to Judah. And he begins pinpointing which one of his children the promised one will come through. And he gives this prophecy to Judah, and he talks about the scepter shall not depart from Judah. And he speaks of a king, of a ruler, that all the other children of Israel would bow down to. Okay, and it actually calls him Shiloh. So before we even get out of the book of Genesis, we know that the Messiah is the seed, the promised seed of Eve, the promised seed of Abraham, and he is also the king of Israel. So the promised one, we don't know too much about him yet, but we do know that he is the seed and the king of Israel from the line of Judah. Okay, so still in Torah, we're going to look at the prophecy of Balaam. And Balaam says this in Numbers 24. He's looking down at Israel, and he says, "How fair are your tents, O Jacob, your dwellings, O Israel. They're so beautiful, they're so fair, like valleys that stretch out, like gardens beside the river, like aloes planted by the Lord, like cedars beside the waters. Water will flow from his buckets." So he's prophesying over Israel, but he starts zeroing in on the Messiah. And Balaam gives another installment of incredibly important messianic prophecy. And he says this, water will flow from his buckets. It's similar to his cup will overflow, right? He's prosperous. And then it says, and his seed will be by many waters. So in other words, it'll be fertilized, it'll be watered, it'll be taken care of, it will be prosperous. And his king shall be higher than Agag. So it talks about the seed and the king of Israel. We know this is talking about the Messiah, and it says he will be exalted above Agag. Now, every translation that you have in English, and probably any other language, will say Agag. Now, there's a really important point here that needs to be emphasized. Agag was an Amalekite king that King Saul fought just like a few chapters later. And Saul was certainly not the Messiah. So you go, what does Agag have to do with the Messiah being exalted above Agag? Well, here's the interesting thing, is every English translation that we have comes from the Masoretic family of texts. These are texts that are, roughly like medieval period. Okay? But when we look back at the earliest, most ancient biblical manuscripts that we have, okay, so the Septuagint, that's a Greek translation of the Old Testament, but it was started like 250 years before Jesus. When we look at the Samaritan Pentateuch, okay, the Samaritans, they were the mixed peoples. They had their own Pentateuch, and they have a very ancient Pentateuch. Again, the 5 books of Moses. When we look at the Samaritan Pentateuch, when we look at one of the fragments in the Dead Sea Scrolls, of which there is one fragment of Numbers 24, as well as 3 very early Jewish translations of the Old Testament into Greek. So you have Symmachus, Theodotion, and Aquila, or Aquila. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. So you've got 6 very ancient biblical manuscripts, much older than the Masoretic texts. Here's the thing. Every single one of them, instead of saying Agag, it says Gog. So the seed in the king of Israel would be exalted above Gog. Okay, so again, this is how it would have been seen and understood by Jesus, by the apostles. So really, in so many ways, Numbers 24 is the first time that the Bible actually mentions the Antichrist by name. Okay, we have the seed of Eve, the descendants of Eve, out of which will come Israel, out of which will come the Messiah. And then on the other hand, you have the seed of Satan, out of which will come the ultimate bad guy. That's Gog. Okay? The Messiah, the king of Israel, the seed in the king of Israel, will be exalted above Gog. Gog is Satan's human sock puppet at the end of the age, through which he will attempt to accomplish his evil purposes. So for anyone who is Old Testament literate, okay, they're simply studying the Old Testament, they're not reading modern-day American prophecy books, who understands the prophetic narrative, who understands the testimony of Jesus, who understands the flow of messianic prophecy. When you get to Ezekiel 38 and 39 and you see this name Gog, you go, oh, that's the same guy. That's the same guy that Balaam prophesied, that said the seed in the king of Israel would be exalted above him. And in the same way that the seed of Israel, the seed of Eve, would crush the head of Satan, so also will he crush the head of Satan's human sock puppet. So if we're to approach this issue of Gog Magog from a biblical perspective, we have to start at the foundation. We have to acknowledge, again, that at the foundation, Gog is understood to be the final, the ultimate evil invader of the land of Israel. He's not a secondary guy. He's not a penultimate invader. He is the final, ultimate sock puppet of Satan. That is the Jewish view. That has been the Jewish interpretation down through history. It's spoken of multiple times by the different Jewish sages and interpreters, and in the Talmud itself and in the Targums and so forth. Gog is always understood to essentially be the Jewish equivalent of the word that Christians use, which is the Antichrist. So we're going to continue looking at the oracle of Ezekiel 38 and 39 in further installments. Until then, thanks for being with us. God bless, and Maranatha.
Thank you for watching this session of End Time Talks. Frontier Alliance International, as an organization and spiritual family, we're focused on laying foundations and making disciples where there are none in the Middle East, specifically in the Muslim world. I want to ask you to consider supporting FAI at just $5 a month. $5 a month is going to go into a pool of a global family of people that are giving $5 a month that goes into the hands of laborers serving on the front lines in the most difficult, challenging places in the world today, laying foundations where there are none and making disciples where there are none. Again, thank you guys for watching, and thank you for supporting FAI.